Come on over.
Hello, everybody.
You know the drill.
I do. Yeah.
Thanks for coming in. Do I get the perfunctory handshake?
Sure.
What'd you think of
Super.
Ray's speech?
I laughed. I cried. It was great. He's good. He's been practicing that, so that's not cheating. That's cheating. I don't practice.
Well, you've got notes here with
I
you.
do, yeah. Unfortunately, they're in Braille, and I'm having a tough time.
I've got my notes here from
Yeah.
your last column, so who's going to start first? Let's
Right.
go.
Okay, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about crows often being smarter than people. They're less likely to get suckered, unlike the Baptist at the big speech that Trump gave last Saturday to his religious group. He was greeted as sort of a religious leader, which was almost orgasmic hypocrisy all the way around. But they do believe in the gospel of wealth, I'd call it. What else going on? We've got this great scam, which I've talked about before, by the public employee union, some of whom have members who are friends of mine, one of which is to let people with any kind of disease developed in the course of their work, like heart disease, which I have, or skin cancer, which I have, and many millions of other people, put that down as a good reason to get a big, juicy disability pension. This is an extraordinary scam and will be richly abused if it goes through, if the governor doesn't veto it. They also want some provision in which contracts can be carried on forever, municipal contracts.
The evergreen contracts.
The evergreen contract, so the contract can be signed during a prosperous time, and the economy goes south, there's no tax revenues plunging, it doesn't matter, the contract goes on, everything is great, and in Naples, Florida, where they'll be living.
So clearly
that's
still
the
plenty
story.
of foot, and you're going to write about it a little bit more for this weekend.
And I think the Paw Sox, I just think Worcester is now making a play for the Paw Sox. I find it rather unlikely. I think they're sort of enthusiastic now because, Worcester's always been off to the side, but that would be a bad place for the Paw Sox because Paw Sox need to be in the main street of the East Coast, which is right over there. Worcester has many fine institutions, the museum and so on, a couple of great colleges, but it's off to the side. So that's not going to work.
So
very
speaking of off to the side, here we are, it's beginning
We're
of
off
July.
the wall, for that matter.
Off the wall,
Yeah.
off the side.
Yeah.
Clearly, the General Assembly session just
Yeah.
broke down
Yeah.
at the 11th
Do they
hour.
hate each other? Does the Senate
Have you
President
seen
Ruggiero?
anything
and
like this?
It's extraordinary. And I can't figure out whether this is really a policy dispute or this is personalities. I think it's to some extent personalities. I tend to agree a little bit more with Senate President Ruggiero. I think the car tax is very regressive and all that, but what happens when the tax revenues go down and the state has to somehow come up with the money to reimburse the cities for the lost car tax? Nobody's answered this question. And I predict there will be another recession in the history of the world.
Well, you
If
did
you
have
look at the business cycle, I think it's going to probably start earlier rather than later.
apparently you disagree with Janet Yellen on that point, which was in your column last
Terrifying.
week.
Yeah, her remarks terrified me. Yeah, we're in the broad sunlit uplands forever. When people say that.
What'd you say it was the opening of
Yeah.
was a salvo for a horror
A
movie?
horror movie, right. We've been down there before.
So you were quite afraid of the comments that Janet Yellen had made.
Yeah.
So, but she's a smart woman, Brown grad.
She's very smart.
So why do you think she's so optimistic about the economy?
Well, maybe she thinks people in the markets are getting nervous. That's why.
Well, anything that comes from the Fed, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah. And she wants to calm them down. But I think she's engaging what Alan Greenspan said in the late 90s, irrational exuberance.
Irrational exuberance.
Irrational exuberance. I
So you
think
saw that,
she's
you
far
sh-
too sanguine.
You saw that and you shuddered.
I did. It was like a 1950s black and white horror movie, Night of the Living Dead. In this case, it'll be Night of the Living Drek.
So I think you have the Janet Yellen comments,
Yeah.
and followed by the
Yeah.
proliferation of rabbits.
That's right. They're everywhere, and they are edible. In France, the French love rabbit. They usually use it with a mustard sauce. I don't know if that's going to happen here, because here they're considered criminally cute and too cute to kill. But they're all over the
Have
place.
you been seeing more rabbits?
Yes, including in downtown Boston. And then I came across the story of the Boston Globe about the rabbits taking over downtown Boston. Very
No.
urban. Yes,
No.
parking lots, yes. Up and down Commonwealth Avenue. In Cambridge, it's so thick. You really have to, you step on them. just going from the out-of-town
Stop
newsstand
it.
to across the street to the entrance
Attack
of the
of the
yard.
Killer Bunnies.
Killer bunnies, Harvard Yards, terrible.
Attack of the Killer Bunnies. But speaking of French,
But they don't bite. They are not carnivorous, so probably you'll be okay.
So
Yeah.
beware of the bunnies.
Yeah.
But speaking of the French, you did bring up French journalist Jean Lesieur, who has
Yeah.
been here in studio,
I know. He loves
and his
you.
book on a friend of the
A
Kennedys.
fascinating story. It's one of the great mysteries in the 20th century, great murder mysteries. It was a woman called Mary Meyer who was formerly married to a high-level CIA guy called Cord Meyer. And she allegedly, if you look at the investigators, of the investigators who've come up over the last 50 years, knew too much about the Kennedy assassination. Now, very important to note, she was a lover of Jack Kennedy. And she really was. This is a true story. Apparently his greatest love. And she ended up being shot by the canal in Georgetown one morning. And then a great cover-up ensued, which was participated in a relative of hers by marriage called Ben Bradley, who was later the editor of the Washington Post. And then there was a man called James Jesus Angleton. I mean, these are names that don't exist in nature. He was the counter-espionage chief of the CIA, even though some people still think he was actually a Soviet mole. So you got this cast of characters. And Jean, this book, when I started reading it, I thought it was a novel. It's actually nonfiction and very well researched.
And it's only in French, though, and you're
Yeah, I read
proficient
French.
in French, yes.
I can read it. And
Is he going to put it out in
it will
English?
It will be out in English, I predict, and it will be a movie. It's one hell of a story. It is a fabulous story. And the more I read, and the more I've read outside of that, I used to believe the story Oswald was the only one involved in killing Kennedy. No, I think there was a plot. Maybe involving the mafia, maybe involving the Cubans, maybe involving the Russians, maybe even involving the CIA.
And no one's touched it here, but Jean Lesieur has written the book that you've
it's
started
very,
it on.
It's very calmly written, though. It's
Maybe
not,
I'll-
he's a very good journalist.
Maybe I'll wipe
Yeah.
off my college
You
French
should.
cobwebs and see
No,
what
it's
I
good.
can.
It's good practice, kid.
Or you can read
Yeah.
it and just
Yeah.
translate it for me.
Yeah, I'll line by line. We do it on here. It'll take up about 4 days and go local. But it's like that thing that they do in New York every once in a while. They have a full reading of The Great Gatsby, which
But-
is going to be very popular.
But I think we probably have to pay Jean Lesieur some
Yeah.
royalties. But
Yeah.
been great. He's Skyped in. He's been here in studio. I look forward to hopefully
Yeah.
reading it in English
Yeah.
sometime soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
So that was from last week.
Right.
What else? So talk with us a little bit. We skipped over politics.
Yeah.
The breakdown of the budget. In the last column, you were
That
kind
surprised me. As you know, I had to,
You had to tweak it a little bit.
I electroshock.
you had to tweak a little
The only
bit.
thing
But
that
one of the
worked.
things that you'd written about that you are supportive of is the free college Rhode Island Promise program.
I think so. I think let's give it a try. I think, of course, it'll depend upon what do they study. I think from a sort of more vocational side, it may work, and it's pretty modest. 2 years community college in Rhode Island. Let's see how it goes. We'll look at it again in 5 years.
Well,
I think it's got some merit.
Here's the $2.5 million,
Yeah.
the $2.5 million question. That the
Yeah.
FY18 budget is not approved. We are
Right.
still operating
Yeah.
on.
They have to go back to the fall to do that, right?
We have to. Well, we don't know when they're going back.
Yeah.
And GoLocal
Yeah.
was the first news site to point out that as of after the budget, CCRI was still touting this scholarship, which is yet to be approved.
And
They've
that has
s-
to wait the new budget, right? Or
Well,
does it? Or
we'll
is
talk
that
a little bit
fuzzy?
about this.
Are
It's a
you
little-
going to pay for it?
It's a little fuzzy, and I'll tell you why. Again, GoLocal pointed out CCRI was touting the scholarship
Stop gloating.
despite the fact they've changed the language since then. But yesterday, Governor Raimondo said, "It's a promise. We're going to keep that promise. We're
Really?
going to fund this program under
From-
the
from
auspices
what?
of the FY17 budget." Apparently, the speaker has made some comments today that that's just not
From
possible.
an increase in the room tax of the Hope Club in Providence, the reading room? I mean, how are they gonna?
But how can you make such funds not
Yeah.
authorized under the existing
I don't think
fiscal
you can
year?
do
seven-
that. Legally,
well,
I'm not sure. That's fuzzy.
fuzzy math.
But I don't know. It could be wrong. She might be able to do it. It sounds very strange.
We'll see. I mean, it was such a big platform issue for
Yeah, and
her
I
to
think,
have it sort of
you know,
hanging out
I've
there.
always
in
been
the,
skeptical about that. I like vocational schools like New York, but I think it's worth a try. Yeah.
well, we don't know when the FY18 budget is
Yeah.
even going to be taken up. The House has clearly dug their heels in, said they don't want the one from the Senate with the amendment. And
Well, how much of this is, Kate, how much of this is policy and principle, and how much is they don't like each other? You know? How much of it is a sort of testosterone eruption? Yeah,
We're
I
only
know.
getting the statements that we get
Yeah.
from the offices themselves.
I didn't realize they disliked each other. I didn't think they had any particular opinion.
Who,
on it.
you know-
They are very strong-willed, as you know.
They both are
Yeah.
very strong.
Yeah, they don't like to
strong-willed
be told what
leaders.
to do.
No.
Right,
No.
yeah.
So who caves? Who
Wins?
Who caves first?
Oh, boy. Well, traditionally, the House Speaker is the most powerful guy in the state, so I would think him, but I don't know. Mr. Ruggiero is a very smart operator and more subtle than the Speaker. More subtle, more labyrinthine, perhaps.
Is labyrinthian an adjective?
Yes,
He's
you know,
he's
kind
more
of
labyrinthian.
More curvilinear, so he may be able to pull something out. But I think
Okay.
he's right. I think he's right. I
About
think we need
being-
more protection for the getting rid of the car tax, driving the state into bankruptcy, or the towns or whatever. There's
Well-
no provision for money to back things up if the economy goes south.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah, okay.
Just yesterday, we had Professor Bob Hackey from Providence
Oh, yeah,
College, who's
yeah.
an expert on the Affordable Care Act, talking again about prospects for what comes out of DC in terms of healthcare. But any way you look
Yeah,
at it,
yeah.
probably going to take a huge hit on the Medicaid front. Which
I
is,
would think so, Kate, but maybe not as much as you might think. This
We'll
has become
see.
so politicized. Even some right-wing states are terrified of losing Medicaid. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Medicaid because the publicity has always been about these exchanges, that which have been sabotaged by the Republicans. By the way, I have to say, as a former Republican, I have to say that with tears, crocodile tears going down my
have you
my cheeks.
rescinded your Republican card? Have you given it back?
I'm now.
Are you independent?
a druid. I'm a druid now. I'm going to wear a hat with a.
Is that a relatively new party?
Yeah. Well, no, it's very old actually. Very old. But I think one thing the public have forgotten, except for poor people, is that actually the biggest thing in the Affordable Care Act was the Medicaid expansion. And the Republicans have been using the problems in some states, not in all states, in the private insurance exchanges as the main, kind of the raison d'etre for that, boy, that pretentious. The reason for deep sixing the Affordable Care Act. But in fact, the big thing, the great advance of the Affordable Care Act was the expansion of Medicaid to poor people. The insurance exchange is a relatively small number of people. Medicaid
It's the big,
covers
it's
far
the,
more
the
people.
bulwark of the.
Far more people, and that's it is to some extent it's a social welfare program. It's made more complicated because it's a state federal program, unlike Medicare, which is only feds. And of course, the Medicare people vote. The people on Medicaid tend not to vote, and they should be ashamed of themselves. Yeah.
So we'll see what ends up happening coming
Yeah.
out of DC. But what
Yeah.
can we expect from you in the column this weekend?
Well, besides
The ones we went over
the crows, about how crows is often smarter than people. Oh yeah, Volvo. Volvo is going to go all electric or hybrid or electric motors starting 2019. They're all the
Really?
Volvo cars. By the way, it's owned by the Chinese. Well, the Chinese own Volvo. It's going to all cars will have to be just have an electric motor or electric and a small gas motor starting 2019, which is like that, very soon. Unlike in America, where the establishment is still very much in a sleeping bag, a single sleeping bag with a fossil fuel industry, the Chinese are pressing ahead with this alternative energy. Another thing I talk about is Thayer Street, where there was a nice piece in the, what's it called, East Side Monthly about Thayer Street by Amanda Grosvenor. And she's, lamenting it's not as funky or edgy as it used to be. Well, I remind everybody, retail is always a churn. And I remember the first time we lived here, before we were forced to leave the country under a cloud for a few years, it was that Thayer Street was considered very stodgy and boring.
Really?
Yeah, blue-haired ladies. A lot of places with shops spelled S-H-O-P-P-E-S.
You do raise an interesting point. I think
Yeah.
everyone thinks of it as
Everything
being
changes.
fun and funky and
No,
record shops and
those two of us
skateboard
stretch,
shops and
Yeah, all that stuff. That's actually historically rather recent. And she should have talked more about, she did talk a little bit about the great catastrophe was the demise of the College Hill bookstore, which is a wonderful, much better than the Brown bookstore.
phenomenal bookstore.
Which is alarmingly mediocre. It's basically a place to buy, beer steins and sweatshirts.
I used to sit in that back children's section on the
Yeah,
steps there.
yeah.
There was an office, and I always had to move with my book.
Oh, yeah,
they had to
right,
go by.
yeah.
That
Well,
was
they
great.
did have armed guards in there, so-
The changes of Thayer Street,
So,
crows,
Yeah,
more on politics.
crows, let me see, I talked about the paw socks, I talked about, anyway, that's basically it. Oh yes, there's a funny quote, funny to me, that I put in at the end of it. It's about how Massachusetts is basically heaven. It was written in 1923, and it's this self-congratulatory message, which is hilarious, but in fact, it's what I pick up from people writing in the Boston Globe now about how Massachusetts is the golden.
It's heaven. It's Shangri-La, huh?
Yeah, Shangri-La.
Oh, that's
Right.
fine.
Heaven on earth.
You got to
yeah.
read Bob Whitcomb's column to get the
Okay.
quote. Always an
That's
interesting
right.
read. Politics, environment, intrigue,
Animals.
and always animals.
Animals.
Rabbits.
Amoeba.
Bob Whitcomb. We will
Ciao.
see you
See you soon.
back in the studio.
See you later. Bye,
Okay.
everybody. Have
Bob
fun.
Whitcomb, GoLocal Columnist, as he does every Thursday, comes into the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center, talks about last week's column, talks about the one coming up, and kind of just everything, all politics. There's plenty to discuss right now, that is for sure, going on here in Rhode Island. So we appreciate Bob coming into the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center, and hopefully we will see him back